Happy Tuesday, everybody. Bloomburrow just released today, so here are 6 of my Bloomburrow brews for the upcoming set. So the first archetype that I want to cover is Boros Mice, and I expect there to be a lot of exploration in this archetype because we got a lot of mice in Bloomburrow, one of which is Mabel, being able to give all of your other mice +1/+1, as well as an equipment that can be handy with triggering Valiant. So Valiant is whenever something gets targeted by a spell or ability that you control, then it triggers Valiant. For example, this one exiles a card from the top of your library. And so along this line, if you wanted to lean more heavily into the equipment, I do think the Lost Jite is particularly good. I decided to not bring it in for my first build, but it's definitely a consideration. The other thing too is that the Boros space, leaning off of like the prowess, works pretty well for the Boros heroic kind of shell. So could run something like Lauren's Escape. But we can also trigger Valiant by targeting with combat tricks like Monstrous Rage. We got Might of the Meek is another way to give yourself that trample and gives you the ability to play and draw a card, similar to the Ancestral Anger that rotated out. We've also got some pretty decent aggressive just 1-drops. So we've got the Flowerfoot Swordmaster, we've got the Heartfire Hero. We also have the Cheeky House Mouse, which is either just a 2/1 for 1 like a Savannah Lion, or it can be a way to target one of your creatures and trigger that Valiant. We also have the Raging Battle Mouse from times gone past that kind of synergizes in to the go low aggro strategy. And then because we're in the Boros space, I figured let's run the Lightning Helixes. So I could see that Lauren's Escape fitting in here instead of like the Lightning Helix. But anytime that you're in Boros, I love running this card. And for the lands, I went with 20 lands. There is the Rockface Village. This is another one that we got. It's a new card from Bloomburrow, being able to give a mouse +1/+0 and haste. Other than that, it's just a lot of the fixing that we already had. And because we were losing the slow lands in the from Midnight Hunt and Crimson Vow, I expect to see a lot more Cavern of Souls, especially in tribal decks like this one for Boros Mice, which is going to hurt the control or any of the counterspell decks. Because I think even outside of tribal decks, we're going to see more of these Cavern of Souls until we see a replacement for the slow lands that rotated out. The second one that I'd like to showcase is one that I've been working on since Timback Trucking shared their Golgari list in the community deck techs, and it got me thinking about the mono green counter space. And part of the reason why this deck doesn't work particularly well is because of Sunfall, right? At least in the past. And so with Azorius Control getting hit pretty hard, it still has Sunfall. But losing the Wandering Emperor and the Memory Deluge and the fact that there's going to be more Cavern of Souls makes me think that maybe there's going to be less Azorius Control in the meta, which would then open up a space for this deck to perform well. And we did get the Innkeeper's Talent, which is kind of like a Luminarch Aspirant ability. It puts a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control, but it's an enchantment, so it's even harder to kill. Then you can also upgrade it for 1 green to give everything that has counters on them Ward 1. And then for 4, you get like a doubling season where you get to double the amount of counters instead. And what I really, the first thing that I think of with the space, or for the counter space, is the Goldvein Hydra, because it comes in with X +1/+1 counters on it. And then when it dies, it creates that equal to its power in treasure tokens. And one thing that we can do is we can do the Honorary Tumblewag to then double the number of +1/+1 counters, and Hydra can get out of control. Excuse me. And then we've also got the Beast Caller, which whenever you cast a creature, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. We've got the Bristly Bill, that whenever you play a land, put a +1/+1 counter on it. I included the Cankerbloom here because you can proliferate and also put, for each 1 counter on everything, put another one on it. Cenote Scout can get a counter if you hit a non-land on your Explorer, so it can be a 1/1 with a +1/+1 counter. Evolving Adaptive gets a +1/+1 counter for each creature that you're playing that has a greater power or toughness. Hard-hitting Question, I think, is probably our best removal in the green space. There is an instant that costs 1 in a green as well. I think that didn't rotate. Tyvar's Stand is a way to kind of make all of that treasure from the Hydra into basically a green blaze, as well as kind of the Snakeskin Veil effect, being able to give something hexproof and indestructible. And then we've also got the Polychronos is really in here just because of being in mono green. It's a nice payoff and can give you that stabilization through the lifelink. And I went with 20 lands for this one as well. Not sure that that's 100% right. It might need to be a little bit higher. I generally start a little bit lower on my lands and then tweak it up as I play the deck. Considerations for this deck, though, there were Archdruid's Charms, particularly good in the mono green space. Bristlebud Farmer is pretty good too. It's kind of like it's not quite Shieldred levels of power, right? But like you still get this for like late game dig and a 5/5 trample for 4. Could definitely make it into this deck. And then Nissa Ascended Animist. This would be another one that if we need to kind of extend the curve to make it more viable against, like, say, mid-range decks, if they're super popular, then we could bring in some of these later game threats. And Nissa being able to give you that overrun, where creatures get +1/+1 for each force you control and gain trample. So there's no really great way to push trample through. The Hydra does have trample, but that's one of the problems, is that they can just like chump block your really big dudes. So thought maybe Nissa Ascended Animus could work well, something to explore. Fountain Port, I was thinking if we did play the Bristlebud Farmer, you've got the food tokens, and then also the tokens off of the Goldvein Hydra. There might be a lot of treasures hanging around in this deck, so it's something to explore. Again, being able to sacrifice a token and draw a card seems like an appealing deck that might make it in, say, over Mirrex, which isn't adding a whole bunch of value to this pile. Right. And so like if I need to move to 21 lands, then what I do is bring in the Fountain Port and explore that. And anyway, just some ideas. This hopefully giving you some ideas as well. That's the whole point of these, right? The third archetype that I'd like to cover is Rakdos Lizards. And so similar to the Boros Mice, it's kind of like one of the archetypes coming from Bloomburrow. The other part of it, though, too, is that a lot of the lizards are also outlaws. So it kind of creates this outlaw space that works really well with the Hellspur Posse Boss, giving them all haste, and Laughing Jasper Flint from Days Gone By. Vile Smasher also, I think, looks pretty good, because whenever an outlaw comes in, deals 1 damage to your opponent, and there's kind of a theme of that, of hitting, like, whenever you cast a lizard spell, deals 1 damage, so you can kind of ping your opponent out if they end up blocking everything. The other thing that we got that isn't a lizard, but I think fits well into the Rakdos space, and I think someone's going to figure out something cool to do with this, because one thing that you can do with Cruel Claw is run the Insatiable Avarice and put the card that you want specifically on top, that you want to pay for free, right? So whether it's Portal to Phyrexia or some big threat, you would be able to tutor for that. Now, I didn't include it in this one because I think that's more of a mid-range combo than just strictly aggro, but something to consider. And instead, what I wanted to do was pair it with Inti. So whenever you discard a card, you can exile the top card of your library and play that card. So you get additional discard synergies that, say we're discarding a land, then we get to play our card for free off the top, while also exiling a card off the top that we get to play the next turn. So I think there's some cool aggressive synergies between Inti and the infamous Cruel Claw. Other than that, I just threw Go for the Throat and Cut Down, just being typical black good removal. As far as we also got some good 1-drops in Bloomburrow with the Vine Lasher being able to deal 1 damage every time that we're playing a land, with Offspring as well, so we can copy it and push it down the curve if we draw it later in the game. We've got the Hired Claw, again, another one that deals 1 damage, and then if they've been getting damaged by all of your little pings, then you can grow it. Gives you kind of a late game mana sink. And then the Valley Rock Collar is probably better in a Rakdos Rats deck, where you have a bunch of 1/1 tokens off of Song of Totentons and Lord Skitter and whatnot. But I think that it works pretty well in any tribal deck that's going to be black. Well, in any tribal deck that's squirrels, bats, lizards, and rats. So this one being mostly lizards, I think the Valley Rock Collar could be good. It's definitely one that I'm gonna want to explore before I put the final stamp of approval on. And then this increasing the damage of your pings by 1, and that's largely the deck. I think there's enough legendary creatures that we could run the Plaza of Heroes for mana fixing. It does make it a little bit awkward that Cut Down and Go for the Throat can't be cast off of the Plaza of Heroes in the Cavern of Souls, so couldn't lean too heavily into that. And then we also got as well. So the red land that I covered during the Boros Mice works well for this lizard deck as well. It might need to be even more copies than just one. Again, the downside being the non-creature spells, and then the black version, the Mudflat Village, being able to return one of our lizards. And funny enough, Hellspur Posse Boss from Outlaws of Thunder Junction is a lizard. So I think that they had this archetype in mind when designing this space. Well, you know what I mean. The fourth one that I'd like to cover today is Orzhov Bats, or at least my take on it, because I've definitely seen some people brewing more heavily, strictly into like another bat tribal deck. And this one I thought fit really well into the Lifegain shell. So I'll do my best to convince you. So we got Zoraline, Cosmos Collar. So this is kind of the card that makes it like, okay, Orzhov is like, we should definitely be doing bats in the black-white space. So whenever a bat you control attacks, you gain 1 life. And when it comes into play or it attacks, you can pay a white and a black and 2 life to return a permanent with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield with a finality counter on it. And I was thinking to myself, like, what are the decks that really have like the busted like 1, 2, and 3 drops, right? Especially in the black-white space. And that's why I thought about the Orzhov Lifegain. And we're losing the Voice of the Blessed, and I think that the Essence Channeler is going to be an interesting substitution for it. So we're going to have a harder time doing the Life Lost this turn. We could run Thran Portal. It will work off of the Caves of Kolios, the Painland, but it could be harder to give this flying, and we could kind of like explore, like I mentioned, the Thran Portal if we really wanted to lean into that. But it's still going to get a +1/+1 counter on it whenever you gain life. And so this can grow into a large threat. And then the upside that the Voice of the Blessed didn't have is that when it dies, you get to shift those counters onto another creature. And so this synergizes, I think, very well with the Amalia space, being able to just move those counters onto Amalia, maybe even hit the 20 meme, which is usually not reserved, or usually done outside of standard, right? We are losing Lunarch Veteran, and so we're gonna have to lean more heavily on Runelurker Bat, and because we're losing that like double ETB effect, right? But we still have the Case of the Uneaten Feast, and we still have the Sadistic Pilgrim. But to replace that 1 drop of Lunarch Veteran, I think the Runelurker Bat works pretty well, has the bat synergies that works with the Zoraline. And then we also have the Deep Cavern Bat was just already in this archetype. And then to combo off of the Zoraline, I also included the Helping Hand, because for 3 mana, what you can do is you can Helping Hand Zoraline back, and then Zoraline's ETB bring back something else as well. So we can get 2 for the price of 1. I think that's a fun little synergy, and kind of gives us an answer if they are able to kill our Amalia or our Essence Channeler, in a way to kind of bring back these recurring threats. Then we've got the Gumdrop Poisoner for all of the life gain and being removal, because this build is, one thing is it is very removal light, and to make room for the kind of graveyard recursion thing, I decided to cut some of the interactions, so it may have been too much. But we also have the Virtue of Persistence, which allows us to have the -3/-3 and gain 2 life. And since this is a low land count as well, it will be difficult and not part of the plan to actually get to the 7 mana. The other thing too that I really liked was Spyglass Siren into Deep Cavern Bat in Dimir aggro. And so I figured Gix would be a pretty good one to include here to be able to leverage that life gain that we're getting to be able to give us card advantage on our opponent. And some of the other considerations for this deck were the Go for the Throat. Again, we might need some more interaction, especially against Mono Red Prowess. Lively Dirge is an alternative to the Helping Hand if we wanted to go into more of a mono black space, because one of the things is Gix Yawgmoth Praetor wants like 18 sources of black, and so it puts a really heavy toll on the mana base, which maybe would be better if we kind of pushed towards a more mono black build instead of a fair amount of white coming into this build. So just an option to keep in mind. Preacher of the Schism, I think, is another one that used to work better when we had the Lunarch Veteran, because we get the life gain off of the 1/1 coming into play. The 1/1 does have lifelink, so it does fit into the strategy. I could see running the Preacher of the Schism over the Gix as well, because it needs less black sources since it's not double pipped. So Preacher of the Schism might be a good replacement for Gix. And then Shielder of the Apocalypse could also be a good one that was explored in some of the Orzhov life gain lists, just because gaining a life every time you draw a card. And just, Shieldred's a boss, right? The fifth archetype that I'd like to cover is Orzhov Discard. And we got a fair amount of discard cards in Bloomburrow. So we got like Ruthless Negotiation, which allows they exile instead of discard, so it doesn't work with the Hostile Investigator, but still, cards out of their hand is good. And then it gives us a flashback where we get to draw a card and further play into the just outvaluing our opponent. We've got the Bandit's Talent, which makes them discard 2 cards unless it's a non-land card that they discard, so 2 lands or a real card. And then also works once we get our opponent hellbent, it can drain them for 2 life, and as well as end up giving us additional card advantage. And the Thought Stalker Warlock is definitely going to see some play, coming in as a 2/2 menace that you get to choose a card from their hand, and otherwise they discard a card. And so like if they only have lands in hand, you still get the discard. And I think the one that I've been playing around with that I like the most is that leans into the discard strategies is the Orzhov Pixie, the Orzhov Control list that I talked about, now a couple weeks ago. Was it last week? Anyway, the one by Cabeza de Bolo that had the Nurturing Pixies and the Braids. Because one of the things that I thought was really unique that I hadn't seen in other lists is including the Novice Inspector to be able to give us the tokens that then we can kind of don't care about to sacrifice for Braids. Because one of the things awkward with Braids is when you're like sacrificing lands because you feel like that's the only thing that you can sacrifice. And so I think this is an interesting way to kind of get Braids to actually work by bringing in the Nurturing, the Novice Inspector and the Nurturing Pixies. And then to lean even further into the blinking our own stuff strategy, bringing in 4 copies of the Guardian of Ghirapur, which you can directly blink this, or you could blink the Pixie and get this to happen, but it happens end of turn, so it's probably better to just blink these. But like these enchantments will trigger again, right? So it's a way to get our opponents to sacrifice a creature again, or to discard more cards. We've got the Hostile Investigator, which synergizes with all of the discard, giving us clue tokens every time that they do discard. And again, I went pretty low on the land count here, so this one was 22. I think that the original build was even more than that, but it was in a best of 3 list, and so best of 1 you get to kind of cheat your lands down a little bit. So that's something to consider, that if you're running these decks that I'm playing in best of 3 or in paper, that you'll definitely want to increase the land count pretty much across the board by at least 1. And then I did end up not really figuring out how to fit in the Sarah Paragon. We could play the Sarah Paragon maybe over the Hostile Investigator if we wanted to kind of push more towards white, but right now the majority is in black. But this allows us to kind of just replay our Tithing Blades and Nurturing Pixies, and it further extends into the value game. Now, one of the things that I have seen is approaches where people have taken the Orzhov Bats into the discard as well, because like Soralina or the 3/3 Vigilance one that can bring things back from the graveyard is a perfectly fine one to hit with the Guardian of Ghirapur or the Nurturing Pixie, right? Like it has a good ETB. So I think between one of these two, like Bats is going to kind of slot in to one or the other, I think, and really curious to see how it goes. And we're going to wrap things up here with Azorius Control. And Azorius Control did get 2 cards from Bloomburrow that I think will help its situation out. So like I mentioned, it lost the Wandering Emperor, and I think we can largely replace the Wandering Emperor with Beza the Bounding Spring. It's going to accomplish a different thing than the Wandering Emperor did, because Wandering Emperor a lot of times was like 2 things of removal and life gain and stabilization, as well as a win condition. So like this has the life gain and this has the win condition. It's not as much of a removal situation as the Wandering Emperor was, but I still, it costs the same. I think it was kind of designed with the idea of replacing Wandering Emperor. And then we also got the Spellgeyer, and I'm not sure if this one is actually going to be better than the Farsight Ritual, but some sort of 2 blue that helps us find our additional threats in the control space, I think is going to need to replace the Memory Deluge. And so this one can be a counter, albeit a very expensive counter, or you can go with Surveilling 2 and drawing 2 cards. So similar to the Memory Deluge, it lets you see 4 cards the first time you play it. Now, it doesn't have the flashback, so it doesn't give you the late game kind of like powerhouse that Memory Deluge was, but it's somewhat of achieving the same part. And I do think that because more and more people are going to, more and more decks are going to be leaning on Cavern of Souls until we get better fixing for the 2-color space, I'm a little bit worried about this archetype in general. So definitely, craft with care. None of this is like I haven't played hundreds of games with any of these. These are all just theory crafts, right? So, but I know some people really love Azorius Control, and it will be around in some form. It's just we got to figure out the right way to kind of take it. So, the choice is yours. So tomorrow I'll be covering my budget builds. So if you are new to Magic the Gathering or returning to Magic the Gathering and you do not have a metric ton of wildcards, then what you can do is, tomorrow I will be covering my 0 rares builds. So everything is all commons and uncommons, as well as some of the rares and mythics that you can look to upgrade with decks that I know are tried and true. And then more to come. I'm going to try to do one every 3 months. We'll see how it goes. Last time I completely dropped the ball. So look for that tomorrow. And if you're new here, welcome to my community. Hope you guys like it. As always, let me know what you think in the comments below. This is all, all for fun and all for brainstorming ideas. So if you have something that you're like, why aren't you including this in this deck? Like, hit me up in the comments. Let me know. And then also, if you play these decks, let me know how it goes. Last time I tried to make some Izzet pirate builds in, I think it might have been in the beginning of Outlaws of Thunder Junction. It's so long ago, I can't remember anymore, but it was a complete flop, right? So some of these aren't going to be perfect decks, right? I do my best. I've been playing Magic the Gathering for a long time, and usually I get reasonably close to a functional archetype. So take care, everybody, and I'll see you all tomorrow.